Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Hymnology, a show about psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, and a little bit of everything in between. My name is Sawyer. I'm so excited about this episode today because we're going to talk about something a little different. Instead of having a specific topic, I really want to draw our attention to a new podcast that's been floating around here for a while about something that I think you all will be interested in, and that is hymns, the history of hymns, and kind of everything in between. And that show is called Hymnpartial. Hymnpartial is hosted by Cara and Monet of Glasgow and Edinburgh, Scotland. So we're going to talk to them a little bit about their show and kind of the story behind where it came from. But also we're going to have another discussion about the differences between the church in Scotland and the church here in America. And depending on where you're watching, you may think maybe this is irrelevant to you, but I would imagine just by hearing different contexts of worship, you would be able to see maybe what you're thankful for in your context of worship. So I hope you enjoyed this interview, and if you stick around for towards the middle of it, we're going to be able to have a clip of exactly what their show is like. So thank you for watching.
All right, everyone, thank you so much for joining us for another episode of Hymnology. And today, for the first time, I have two guests on the show, although they are a part of one team, and they're also my first guests from across the pond. So I'm so happy to have with me Monet and Cara from the Hymnpartial podcast. Thank you guys so much for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah. So let's talk real quick. You two, like I just mentioned, you are the host of a podcast called Hymnpartial. Now we're going to get into the show in just a second, but I really like if you would just kind of talk about yourselves. You guys really do a lot of work in kind of the same field, same area that I talk about. And so I'd love to just kind of hear your background, your church background, kind of how you guys met. And all that. So whoever wants to start, just go ahead.
Okay. So how we met is probably the easiest one. Monet was going to the same church as me for a couple of years. My church that I still belong to trained up her husband, who is working in a sort of church plant revitalization work. So they were with us for a couple of years and then they went out.
Okay. All right. So you guys met each other through the church that you went to, right?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. And Monet, how did you, so you guys are serving in a church plant. Is that kind of what I got from that?
Yeah, we're constituted kind of revitalization work. And yeah, so that's what my husband does. And so we moved to a city just about an hour away from where Cara is. And we've been here for 4 years. So it's a very different background in terms of church, like compared to what I was raised in. I guess raised in my faith because I wasn't raised in the church, but it's been a really great experience, I think. Coming from a Calvinistic, Baptistic background to now for the last 6-7 years being in a Reformed Baptist context in another country. It's been a lot of learning for me. And even though Cara maybe didn't have the hop across the pond, I think she's had a similar kind of journey in terms of the type of churches that she's belonged to and her family attended when she was raised in the faith.
Yeah. So, Cara, when I was listening to one of your episodes, it was your get to know you episodes. You kind of had an interesting story about your kind of starting with your parents, and then you kind of just went through what your kind of evolution of church life has been like for you. And obviously now you're the host of a show that talks about hymns. So I don't imagine you started that way. So can you kind of tell that story about kind of your background in church?
Yeah, so my parents were Christians when I was born, but they didn't come from Christian families. So they kind of were just trying to do their best with what they knew, which wasn't a lot. And we moved around a lot because my dad was in the forces. So they kind of just went where they thought the preaching was good. We didn't have any real concept of of how a church should be structured or the whole thing about baptism or anything like that. And it wasn't until about 10 or 15 years ago when we started going to a Reformed church. Before that, we'd been in I don't know if Baptist Union means anything to you, but it's like kind of semi-liberal Baptist. The sort of people that quote like Rick Warren and people like that. This was mid 2000s. Yeah.
Okay.
So we ended up in a Reformed church.
Which was a dangerous time in the church anyway, the early 2000s. You never knew exactly what you were going to get. So.
Between the music and the youth work and oh gosh.
Yeah.
We ended up in a Reformed church. I did not like it. I hated the organ. I didn't get the hymns. And it wasn't until I started reading the hymns before the service, because we used to have them on a little board, put the numbers up. And I'd look them up because I was like, if I don't read them before, then I'm not going to understand what they're on about. So I started reading them, and then I started remembering them, and I just went from there.
Okay, so that's where you are now.
I'm in a different church now. I moved. I went to university, and then there was no work in my hometown, so I moved to Edinburgh because my previous church sent the pastor of my current church to plant the church I'm in now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So, but you're still kind of in that same tradition then from where your parents kind of ended up being. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So that's interesting. And I will say this, one thing that will probably be a good practice is for us to look at the songs we're actually about to sing before we sing them. And like you said, get a grasp of what we're actually singing. Because I know you guys go through several songs that we've had. What exactly, like Come Thou Fount, what exactly is a fetter? My brain goes to ferret, sometimes whenever I'm looking at some of these words. So what do some of these words mean? Okay, well, that's interesting. So tell me about both of your music backgrounds, because you do have a little bit of music background, right?
Monet more than me.
Yeah.
Okay, Monet, what you got?
That's half true. I'm older, so I have more experience in
a little
life.
More time.
Yeah, I've just had more time on the planet. I think we both, and Carl will speak to this when she answers the question, but I think we both had a very non-traditional route in our experience with music. So I had come from a musical family. I've been singing since I was like 3 or younger. And so music has always been a part of my life, just because. And my family are not Christians, so, and they weren't when I was growing up. So that just really expanded my music exposure in the sense that I listened to everything. And even in high school and university, one of my childhood friends was a music writer. She went to journalism school and all that. So she's still involved heavily in music over at Juilliard. And so I had this huge exposure to music, but I didn't start to formally learn it until I was in middle school. I played the cello. I probably played it poorly, but in my memory, I was amazing. I was like, I was a prodigy. But I only played it for middle school. And then I don't know why, but for whatever reason, when I got to high school, I switched to choir. And so it was using some of the kind of formal music training that I picked up in middle school and applying it to voice. And I had great instructors both in high school and in college, university. That's where I continued that. So really, in terms of formal music, I spent more time in choir than I did in orchestra.
Now, did you grow up in the States, or did you grow up in Scotland?
Yeah. I grew up in Los Angeles. Okay. Born and bred.
Okay.
Though I went to school mostly in the Valley. If anybody's from Los Angeles, they know what I'm talking about. Gotcha. But yeah, so that was my exposure. And then I was saved by the grace of God. I was saved in university. When most people walk away from their faith, that's when I was called to the Lord. And so it was through my church um, that I started to gain interest in the guitar, but I had no idea how to play it. And the lady who led our worship sung worship at the time, I was part of like the little team there. She played the guitar and I just loved her to death. And I was like, I want to be exactly like her. So I actually took a course at my school to learn classical guitar. It was just one semester, just so I could understand the basics.
Right. Yeah.
And then from there, I just picked up the chords. So I play not the cello anymore. I don't sing in choir anymore. I play the guitar poorly and I sing. So that's why.
Okay.
That's my
You got
background.
the background though, if you ever had to polish it up anytime soon.
Yeah.
Maybe, interesting. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, Cara, what about you?
So there was a program in our primary school where they would like audition kids, and if they weren't too dumb, they would give them an instrument and teach them how to play it.
Gotcha.
And I just about hit the IQ level. So
okay.
I learned the violin. I really wanted to learn the cello, but my brother got that and I was so jealous. But when he got to high school, he got fed up with cello and he told me that if I bought him an electric guitar, I could have his cello, which was an amazing deal for me.
That's a good deal. Yeah, that's
so
a good deal.
I picked up the cello at that point.
Nice.
You have a musical background. That we know your kind of church background, your church upbringing. And now here you are. Both of you are in the Reformed context of worship. So how did you get from where you were to, hey, here's an idea. Let's talk about some songs that are a few hundred years old and hope someone listens to it. So how did the idea of the show come about?
I was stripping one of the rooms in the flat and my friend sent me a podcast, and it was a special from Revive Our Hearts, and they were talking about the history of Be Still My Soul, which is one of our favorite hymns.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh, I'd like to listen to some more episodes like this, but it was a special and they hadn't done any more. So I went looking for a podcast that did something like that and I couldn't find one.
Yeah.
So I texted Monet and I was like, do you think there's actually an audience for this? Because I can't find anything. Yeah. And she said yes. And I said, do you want to do it? And she said yes. And that was the end of that.
There you go. Yeah, that's pretty easy. Okay, so that's good. And listen, I think that it's a great thing that thought came in your head, because these are, like you said earlier, when we're sitting in church as kids, we look at the hymnal and we don't necessarily know what the notes mean. And a lot of times we don't know what the words mean. And hopefully, these kind of shows like yours and others can help that in the future. So with the show, kind of just tell me a little bit about maybe kind of your favorite moment so far, because you guys, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to share a screen real quick on your Spotify, and I'm just going to kind of scroll through. So you guys have had several episodes. Where are we at? Let's see where we're at now. Number 72. So number 72 is good. I mean, it's not quite a quarter of the way through a normal hymnal, but you guys are doing pretty good. That's a lot. So starting at the very beginning, of course we have Christmas episode. Start at the very beginning, and the unexpected story of Amazing Grace. So that was the first one. What made you think, okay, hey, Amazing Grace, here we go? Because I did that too, and I realized maybe that's too much, because there is so much there with Amazing Grace. So, what was the thought of saying, hey, you know what, we are going to start with Amazing Grace?
I mean, there's a cynical answer to that, but I think we were thinking, we're nobody, and why would somebody want to listen to us say anything, really? So we thought, well, a lot of people know the hymn Amazing Grace. There might be quite a wide range of Christians and non-Christians that would want to know the background of this song.
Yeah.
So maybe somebody will be searching and find us and like we have to say. Or also, even people who we know, they might be like, what is this obscure song you're talking about? Oh, I know Amazing Grace.
Yeah.
And they'd be keen to listen to us. So I think it was pretty much like, let's hit the main song, the song. When you talk about hymns to a wide audience, they're, oh, amazing. I know Amazing Grace. Does that end? Right. But we immediately shook it up and did something that we really haven't done since. And I think we'll try to change that. But we talked about the organ. It was the history of the organ. And that episode was really, really fun. So we tried to, and I think we still do, we talk mostly about hymns and hymn writers, but we also just talk about church music in more general terms, so we talked about exclusive psalmody and that kind of controversy that that has and is taking place in churches all over the West, maybe the world as well. We've had pastors on to talk about church planting and music and depression and William Cooper. And so we've tried to mix it up so that we're not just one thing, just because I do think all of those things factor into how thoughtful we are as Christians when it comes to the song bit of the worship service. Right. Or even how we think of the song bit of the worship service, or how we think of worship, because some people think that's only the music. Right. So I think that's kind of how we've thought of our episodes from the beginning until now.
Okay, so let's talk about, we were talking about some of your favorite kind of moments and all the highlights of what you guys have talked about. Tell me about some of the guests that you've had on. You have a pretty good list of guests and hymn writers and songwriters. Can you mind sharing some of those and kind of some of the stories that you were able to talk about with them?
Yep. So we did a Christmas series last year. We've had on, Monet will keep me right, we've had Sandra McCracken, Jeremy Casella, Matt Boswell. We've also had Randall Goodgame on, and the Gettys. And then we've had some other people as well that may not be as well known, more broadly known, like Samuel Say and Jeremy Walker. And we've got more coming up, but we can't talk about that yet.
I understand.
Yeah. We've had wonderful guests too, more obscure than obscure is not a nice word. Maybe not as well known, but known enough. I mean, we had Brian Croft on, and Brian Croft has written loads and loads of books and done conferences with some of the people that we've just mentioned. But we've also had local pastors on from England, Scotland, and that's been really great because I think our guests, whether they're super famous or only known to our church network or known in our country, have all brought something to the table that we just couldn't. Namely, a lot of them are pastors, and they bring that pastoral element that we do not, and that we would not. And that's really, really helpful because I think a lot of the things that we talk about on the show raise questions about, ministry issues or things that involve the wisdom of the word that I do think is just handled so well by so many of our guests. And then sometimes we're surprised, like in maybe to our shame, but we'll have songwriters on and they'll just be preaching at us. And I'm like, amen, and that's such a great thing as a host to have folks come on and just really encourage our listeners and us to be, in the word and thinking about the application of these things.
You got to watch out for the songwriters. They don't get the pulpit quite as often. Usually it's just their pen and paper. So when they get a platform, they're going to let it loose. But that's good. So to kind of wrap up this part, where can we watch your show? Is it YouTube? Is it mainly a podcast, or?
It's anywhere and everywhere.
No.
Okay.
You can't mainly.
It is a podcast. It's on every podcasting platform. If you have a podcasting platform and you can't find us, then we're some obscure one, and we will get ourselves on there.
You probably don't need to be on it then.
No.
If that's the way it is.
But we're also on YouTube as well. But
Okay.
yeah, we are a podcast. Yeah.
And you do a video format on YouTube?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, I'm recording.
Cool. Hi, I'm Monet, and I'm super cool. This is Cara. She's okay.
Do you ever find yourself thinking, hymns are so boring?
They're just written by a bunch of stuffy dead white guys.
Who even came up with an instrument as weird as the organ?
Or do you find yourself just singing the words every Sunday and never really thinking about what they're saying?
Or where they came from?
Or why we sing them? Then this podcast is for you.
We're back with another episode of Hymnpartial, where we talk all things church music.
In essence, hymns go far beyond poetry. They're less florid, and they're far simpler to understand.
The lyrics of this hymn are the real story. The original hymn is 5 verses long.
And her pastor was called George W. Shrek. So today we're going to talk about another really well-known hymn and its author, and put the kettle on for this one because it is a tale of descent, of unrequited love, and of a whiny teenager who ended up changing church music across the Western world. But here's the thing, see when your boat's going down and you're about to drown, nobody sings John Lennon's Imagine.
Yeah.
It's just true, you know it's true.
So I knew singing was a big part. It was a huge part of the service. I felt like, are we going to be done singing soon? Because it was just like a lot of singing. Come join the conversation as we learn a new appreciation for church music, old and new.
Like, subscribe, and we'll see you Monday for another episode of Hymnpartial.
Okay, so earlier, you guys mentioned your guests. A lot of them were local pastors and just kind of in your area. So let's kind of like change the conversation over to something that's important and something that we probably don't think about, is what worship looks like outside of our context, outside of the local church context. Now, you know, we're obviously not talking about more likely probably not a huge difference in local churches from where we are, but let's kind of go down the line. And since Monet, I've got you up here at the top by me. Let's go with you first. So what does worship look like in your local church? And I know when I say worship, that can mean a lot of things, but I'm going to let you interpret that however you want. So what does worship look like in your church, in your congregation?
Yeah, huge question.
If you'll tell me, and if you'll say where your church is too, that would help.
Yeah. So our church is on the south side of Glasgow in Scotland.
Okay.
We're a Reformed Baptist church, small Reformed Baptist church. And honestly, it is probably different from most of the scenes in Glasgow, like within even our local context.
Okay.
I think there is a culture in the Reformed tradition, definitely Reformed Baptist, definitely Reformed Scottish Baptist Church, that is a lot more reserved, more conservative in how we worship the Lord through prayer, preaching, song, even through communion and fellowship. I think it's a very kind of sober, somber sometimes experience.
Reformed people tend to be a little more somber than they probably need to.
More somber. Lots of joy, though. Lots of joy.
Yes.
Inexpressible joy, though.
Inexpressible.
That's right. That's right.
So yeah, it is a little different, I think, maybe like I said, than even other churches in the same locations that that I'm in.
So in, you know, kind of where I am, the if we were to call ourselves a Reformed Baptist church, we would be an oddball. Okay. So 100%, even if in where I'm at currently, if we were to call ourselves any Reformed denomination, we'd be an oddball. So what's the climate like in your context, as far as, you know, denominationally, and then just culturally in your area? What is it like?
Yeah. Baptists full stop are the minority in Scotland. We are in
Okay.
Presbyterian country.
Yeah.
That is the state church. It's a Presbyterian church, Church of
Okay.
Scotland. And all of the kind of reformed offshoots of that are Presbyterian.
Okay.
So to be Baptist in Scotland is already to be a little odd.
Okay.
But the Baptist churches that exist, I would say probably, Cara will correct me on this, a majority of them are Baptist Union,
Yeah.
which is a union that I won't be as harsh in my language,
Yeah.
but it
Yeah.
is not as closely married to what we would call kind of Orthodox Christianity in their ecclesiology, in their view of leadership, eldership, all of that stuff. So they're just tend to be, I hate to use a spectrum, but they're just a little bit more liberal than we would probably be comfortable with. But there are still faithful Baptist churches within that union. And then you have the independent Baptist churches that are kind of sprinkled all over the country. So it is like, how weird can you get? It just keeps getting, the circle keeps getting smaller for the Reformed. In fact, I'm pretty sure I know of every single Reformed Baptist church in Scotland, if not by name, by location. I know where they are.
Yeah. Okay, so that's interesting because, especially at least in my state, in Alabama, we I could count on maybe one hand of how many Presbyterian churches I know.
Really? Oh yeah,
in
the South.
Yeah, not a lot. And even less than that, how many Reformed Baptist churches there are. We don't necessarily have. There is denominations for that, but typically what we have the Southern Baptist Convention, which is the one of the South. When you go further north, it's further north of the states, it's more Catholic, and you may run into more Presbyterians. But to hear that and to hear about the Baptist Union, kind of reminds me more of some of our more United Methodist churches that we have kind of in our area. So same deal, just different names. kind of the same situation. So that's interesting. And historically, we know why you guys had more Presbyterians, we had more Baptists. For one, I think mainly it's just because it's hotter here and we just prefer to dunk all the way, but as opposed to just sprinkle. So, but okay. So, Cara, so you said that your church is where Monet and what's your husband's name, Monet?
Daniel.
And Daniel so your church, Monet, your husband and your church came from Cara's church as kind of like a church plant.
Yeah, we were.
And I know I'm using maybe the right words. Yeah. So, Cara, can you just kind of explain what church looks like in your context and about where are you located?
So I'm in Edinburgh, and we're sort of in the north. We used to be in the west, but it's a long story. So Edinburgh's a bit odd in that it's not a very Scottish city because we have such a melting pot of different cultures and different nationalities and things, just because I don't know why, but lots of students and things, lots of people come here. So we have quite a wide variety of churches. In our area, there is the parish church, so that's the state church. And then there's an Episcopalian church, which is borrowed in the afternoon by a prosperity gospel church. And then there's a massive Catholic cathedral at the top of the road. So it's quite a mix. It's quite interesting. There are some good things going on in Edinburgh, but a lot of the churches just aren't great. There are a lot of prosperity churches and there are a lot of parish churches, and neither of those are great at preaching the actual gospel. Okay.
And so when you said parish church, that's Church of the State.
So Church of Scotland. So the whole country is split up into chunks, and each chunk is called a parish, and every parish has a church.
Okay. Yeah. So another difference. We don't have that.
Yeah.
Where,
Well, we
where
don't
I
have a
am,
state church in the
yeah.
States.
Sometimes our state church is the NFL. It depends on or college football. Depends on where it is. But yeah, so we don't necessarily have that, but we definitely have the one that where most people lean. So that's an interesting dynamic, because not only are you kind of fighting for just conservative Christianity and biblical truth, but you're also fighting against not a separation of church and state. And that's probably a big difference that I know for a fact we don't realize over here quite as often, is that there is a church of the state in other areas. And what is that like?
Sorry.
You go ahead, Monet. You go ahead.
I would just say, just to clarify that while there is a state church, they don't have any say, authority over our local Baptist churches. We do still have that freedom to operate as an independent Baptist church within the government, and there's no kind of they don't select our pastors, they don't regulate our pay, et cetera, in the way that they do for the state church. All of that is kind of baked in.
Gotcha.
The other thing I would clarify is, while we are currently, Cara and I, talking about the state of the churches in our area, what should be made very clear is that Scotland is a very secular country.
Yes.
Edinburgh being quite secular. So while there are church buildings, most of them are dead or have been converted into various centers of not worship. And a lot of like mindfulness, new age kind of
a lot of new
therapeutic.
age.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of Wiccanism is on the rise, paganism. So Scotland, although you could say technically the UK is a Christian country, it's not a Christian country at all. It's very secular.
Yeah, and we can relate to that for sure. In God we trust only gets us so far. Depending kind of where we go. Okay, so that's the context, kind of where we are now. Let's just kind of talk about liturgy. Would you say that where you all, and you can just kind of go whenever you need to, would you say that where you are has a specific liturgy that's written out? Is it more of a kind of a less formal order of worship, or kind of what does that look like in your context?
So we don't have a fixed liturgy, but there is tends to be structure to our service. So we have like the call to worship, and we have singing, and we have often a children's talk. And then we'll have more singing, and we might have communion or things like that. And then we'll have the sermon. So there is kind of like a structure to it, but it's not a fixed sort of call and response style liturgy like you might get in an Anglican church.
Okay, and is that mainly the Anglican tradition there, or is that Presbyterian as well? Because there are a lot of our Presbyterian churches here follow more of a formal type liturgy like that.
The Church of Scotland does. I was at a wedding recently that was Church of Scotland, and they had a liturgy, and it was interesting. But for a number of reasons. But I don't know. I think the Free Church, they have a similar sort of hymn sandwich structure, or psalm sandwich structure. But I don't really know that they use a fixed liturgy.
Okay. Yeah, and it's usually typically a little more creative. You have a little bit of more liberty to kind of, you add in what you want and what you don't want. But in my experience, that's typically has been how it's been. So not a lot of difference then between the Baptist worlds there. Your service sounded a lot like mine. As the worship pastor, we do the call to worship. We do have a moment for kids. And what about one thing I'm interested in? What about more of like and this will change per denomination, especially more on the Reform side of things, like an altar call, or like a time of response or invitation to the message. Is that a common thing there?
Not within our particular churches. There would always be a call to respond to especially the word and the preaching of the word in repentance. But it wouldn't be a public thing. It wouldn't be come to the front unless things have changed since I left, Cara. I don't think that's how they roll in Edinburgh.
No, it's usually like if you want to talk about it, come talk to one of the elders afterwards.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and that a lot of that here, we call it the altar is open a lot of the times where you come on down the aisle, and that has caused a lot of trouble over the past few years. Maybe some false conversions. You never really know, but really, like I say, kind of came from revivalism and Billy Graham era. Really strong there. But I do appreciate the fact that there should always be a response, whether it's a physical walk on down or a more of a contemplative response for repentance. Let's talk preaching for a second, and then we'll talk about music. Obviously, you, from what I can tell, you ladies are from conservative, are in conservative congregations, so. So it would be more of a complementarian thought process, correct, when it comes to preaching and who roles in the church, as opposed to egalitarian.
Yes, definitely. We are very firmly convinced that Scripture is clear about who leads the church, and it ain't us.
And that's a whole nother conversation. But to get obviously there are we're not going to go there because there's lots of things that we can go there. But to say that preaching wise, what do you typically hear as far as preaching goes? You normally hear more. You have more of an expository sermon each week, or?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, both churches are led by, I have to say wonderful, because one of them is my husband. Wonderful men of God who are committed.
You don't have to. My wife doesn't always say that.
Do. I do. Yeah. Yes, wonderful men who are committed to the expository, spirit-led preaching of the word.
So we talked about preaching. We talked about kind of the culture of your church. Now let's kind of get down to what we are obviously most passionate about. Not that we're most passionate about it, but we are very passionate about the types of songs we sing. In your church, what are you going to hear on a Sunday morning?
Oh, depends on the Sunday.
Okay.
We usually sing, like my church, we usually sing from Christian hymns, but we also have a supplementary hymn book which has some Sovereign Grace and some gaieties and some other stuff that's not in Christian hymns, but it's still good music. So
what hymnal is that? Is that Hymns of Grace?
No, it's honestly just a little folder booklet thing that we've printed off lyrics and we sing stuff.
Okay, hey, that's what I typically do for our one of our services, is just print out our own little hymnal sometimes, and it works. Okay, so Christian hymns so that is a hymnal that you use. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. And so typically most Sundays that's what you would be out of. And so what does that look like? Is that a projector screen? Is that everybody holds their own hymnal? Or kind of how do you guys do that?
I have been in a church meeting, not at my current church, where a projector was suggested and very strongly shot down.
Okay.
We don't mind projectors, but normally we just have individual hymn books.
Okay.
It's similar at my church as well, but we don't have a supplementary hymnal. We just will print out as and when there's another song that's not in the book that we need to sing. I think the important thing to note for my church is that my husband picks out the songs, and so he might say, here's the subjects, bring me 2 or 3 songs on this and that, and then he ultimately picks it. Often what'll happen is he'll just be listening to a random album throughout the week, or he'll have opened up a random hymnal that we have in the house, and he'll be like, you know what, this is a great song. Can you learn to play this? And that's usually when we'll have those printouts, which is actually really great, because I trust him to, because he's also leading the service, which might be a difference in our churches. Is usually someone who leads the service. Sometimes that's the same person who is also preaching. And so because my husband's leading the service, most days it's great because I know that whatever songs that we sing will just be part of that, building upon that theme, whatever that theme is for that Sunday.
So like you did, so like you said, let's talk about, I would say probably is one of the major differences. And I would say that's not just, this is not a denominational thing. This is a kind of a church culture thing. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if we said this before we started recording or not, but my job title on my tax form is worship pastor of First Baptist Church Hayden. And every week, I'm not the pastor. I don't preach, but I'm on full-time staff at our church, and our pastor selects his sermon, and he trusts me most weeks to select our songs of worship, and a lot of times scripture readings throughout the service. But that is not necessarily the case where you guys are. That is typically the case here. We have a pastor, and we have a youth pastor and a worship pastor. But not the case necessarily with you guys. Kind of explain how your church structure works.
Well, I think the main reason why that difference occurs is just due to size. I could say this because I'm an American. The American church tends to be a lot bigger than the rest of the global church. You'll find very few churches in the world that even have hundreds of people there. 100 is that church is, man, wow, you got a rocking church. You got 100 people there. So it mainly has to do with size, I think, but primarily, so I guess secondarily it has to do with size. Primarily, it might be the way our churches are structured. I'm not quite sure, but ours are elder-led churches, and so whatever in terms of the Sunday services or midweek services or whatever kind of thing that we're putting on, that those are really being led by and taught by our elders. Obviously it's not a 1-man or 2-man or 3-man show, because Cara and I both play on Sundays, play the music, but it is under that kind of elder-led structure, for lack of a better term. And if there was 5-10 elders or whatever, I'm just making up a number, and the I guess main teaching pastor needed to free up some of his time, then we might have a pastor for music and a pastor for these other things. But at the moment, it would just be extra superfluous.
Understand.
Context. Sorry. I was just going to say, for context, the church I'm in, we have, I'm not sure of the exact number, but it's 30 to 40 members. And that's one of the biggest in Scotland. So just for context, when you've got 30 to 40 members, you don't really have the manpower to be hiring extra people.
And that is a good point, because we're running low right now because of COVID, and low for us is right. And it's not bragging. I'm just telling you, this is kind of where we are. 150 is average for us right now. And before the story is, before I got here, a little less than a year ago, is that we were running, 300-ish, and that is considered not big, it's not, and here it would be, but depending on where we were, just lit services for a revival service that we had, that reminded me of kind of what you guys were talking about. We do have more rural congregations that you're doing good to have 20. You're doing good,
Mhm.
and those churches do not have.
Mhm.
You don't have that staff of a church, and
Mhm.
so that is kind of what and that's kind of where I grew up, kind of in that context. So your pastor would lead the singing, I guess, is kind of how that would go, and then you have church instrumentalists is kind of the way that would look. Okay. Yeah, and so I talked to Matthew Montgomery not too long ago about instrumentation in worship, and he's a phenomenal guitarist and everything else he does, and yeah, he had a lot to say about that too, where there is a separation, but both can serve, whether you're the worship pastor or you are bringing glory to God and with your gifts. Before we finish out, we've got to talk about hymns, specific hymns. I have specific hymns that are in my head every single day, that me and my wife sing either together or we sing just in our brains, or to our daughter or anything like that. And I feel like those hymns are what are kind of get us going and kind of get us to where we are today. So what are hymns that really have kind of made you passionate about talking about this topic week in and week out on Hymnpartial? I could say just what's your favorite hymn, but there is a difference between what got you to where you are.
Asking what our favorite hymn is also difficult.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, that episode on Be Still My Soul started it all, so I guess you could blame that one.
Yeah. To Be Still My Soul, and
sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I was thinking, just because we just talked about it, I wanted to plug a song that no one's ever heard of before, because it was the lyrics of this song in us discussing it that made me hope put out there that someone needed to do a new tune for it, because the hymn lyrics are excellent and the tune is okay. And it's a song we just talked about on our show, called Sing Praise to the God Who Reigns. And it's obscure, but it is about the providence of the Lord. It's actually a translated hymn from German to English. And honestly, I think just the fact that that's the song I wanted to come on here and talk about it goes to the point of like why we all do what we do on our shows, is to be mindful and careful. Maybe that's too strong of a word, but careful about how we sing praises to the Lord. Like, what are we actually saying? And is this, how like to actually be more reflective on it. And that song is really good. It's, I mean, like I said, the tune's okay, but the lyrics are fantastic. So, if you're in some kind of music collective, then do it up.
Is that a Luther hymn, or who is the author of that hymn?
Johann Jakob Schütz.
Okay.
If you've heard of
I'll make
him,
sure
well
I posted from the episode that you.
Good.
I'm not even going to pretend to. I like to start. Okay, well that's good. Yeah, and that's a whole nother conversation about hymns and hymns retuning that I spoke with somebody not too long ago about. Well, okay, guys, I appreciate your time. I know that it is a big world, and there are a lot of history to jump into the world of hymns. And in my context and possibly yours, it can be an either or. We're going to sing hymns of old, or we're going to sing something that came out a couple of years ago, and that's the discussion. But I think maybe being educated on all of it could kind of mend that gap just a little bit. So thank you, Monet and Cara, for joining us, and be sure to listen, watch, or whatever it is you want to do to Hymnpartial, and you can find it wherever episodes are streamed. Thank you guys again so much for joining me.
Thanks so much for having
Thanks
us on the
for having
show.
us.
Well, I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Cara and Monet. I hope you were able to take away that church is different all across the world. And although it may not seem like it's that much different from your church, we can at least take from this that maybe we need to look outside of our world, outside of the bubble that we live in, and see how others worship. In the meantime, be sure to listen to the Hymnpartial podcast. You can stream it wherever you listen to podcasts. But thank you again so much for watching, and I hope you'll join me next week.